Hello to everyone in Lowell, and welcome to Recovery Matters. This is a show of Lowell House, and as you all know about Lowell House, we're entering our 50th year in business. It's 1971. We were just discussing the 70s, and what a great time that was. So welcome, and we try to touch on topics that relate to substance use disorder, mental health, and some of the things that affect families and individuals. This is actually our 8th show, and we've done some great things that we've talked about and wonderful things on our show. So we hope it's been informative to you. They're all on our website at www.lowellhouseinc.org. I guess I don't need to use the W's anymore. lowellhouseinc.org under our films, and you can see those. So please go through them. There are some great adventures. And I just happened to meet with Kathy Kelly the other day from Alternative House, and she said, I saw you on TV. And that was wonderful for you to say. And she said, I enjoyed the show. So I said, come on, because I've always wanted to talk about domestic violence. And I think it's such an important topic for us, so little understood, and really ties so much into addiction treatment, mental health disorders, and all the other things we do, not exclusively, so I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. But let's begin. Let me introduce you to our two guests today, and I'm so glad to have them on. They're good friends. I've known both since I came to Lowell almost 7 years ago. Wow. That was a long time.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes. Yeah.
So Kathy Kelly, as I mentioned, the Executive Director of Alternative House, and Deb Chaussee from House of Hope. Such an impressive agency. You've done so much, and new headquarters now. You both are doing terrific agencies, and we're so happy to have you here. We deal with so many clients conjointly,
Yep.
and we communicate so well. So as you know, Lowell's a very special place for human service agencies. We are one big community. We just love each other. We really do. I think this is great respect. So let me hear from you a little bit about your agency, and let's start by defining what is domestic violence. What does that mean? Because we all have arguments with our spouses, with our partners, with our friends, but we don't commit domestic violence. So Kathy, why don't you tell a little bit about your agency and a little bit about what you consider domestic violence?
Well, Alternative House has been in operation now since 1978, 41 years.
Wow, all right.
And started out by a group of volunteers providing an emergency shelter and a 24-hour crisis hotline for those who were experiencing what was referred to back then as family problems. Has evolved to this day, fast forward. Alternative House still has an emergency shelter. It's really the grounding of our agency. We provide emergency shelter to survivors of domestic violence, as well as a 2-year transitional housing program, 6 units of permanent affordable housing for victims of domestic violence. We do a lot of community outreach, education, children's supervised visitation services. So we've grown in many ways, but we have stayed focused on really providing support and services to those who are experiencing domestic violence and really wanting to, at some time, perhaps break free from that relationship, turn to us for shelter or to other supports for shelter to move on with their lives.
That's great. And we want to talk a little bit later about why people sustain those relationships for so long. And I'll tell you a little story about my family. Deb Chaussee, House of Hope.
Yeah.
You've been around for a few years.
Yeah. House of Hope has also been around for decades. So we're probably 3 of the longer standing nonprofits in the city right now. And I think one of the things that we all have in common is how dependent upon the community at large we've always have been. That's where our strength comes from as an organization. So not only does House of Hope run a number of emergency shelters for homeless families, totaling 58 families a night now.
Wow.
I mean, that's 150 or more individuals that are sheltered by House of Hope. We also have a permanent housing arm where we develop and we operate permanent housing for families coming out of shelter and provide support services. The housing is permanent, nobody has to leave ever. Hopefully we're going to get to that second generation and give the kids a stable and a safe home environment. And all of those units are subsidized, and that's through the generosity of the state and the city. And private donors. So our portfolio is at 38 units of permanent housing right now.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
So you really developed that continuum.
We did.
Where people can come in an emergency, maybe even come in from alternative house, and ultimately get permanent housing.
Right.
And that's wonderful.
And that stemmed from our board concluding, as a result of a strategic planning process, that no matter how good our emergency shelter is and how many units we have, it will never solve the problem of homelessness.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing that will solve the problem of homelessness is homes.
Right.
So the board made a commitment to that, and slowly but surely we've built that portfolio.
Yeah, and I think the city has come to a realization that you can't end homelessness without homes.
Right.
So I think they're doing a lot with rapid rehousing and trying to get more units out there for people. Yet there are still people on the street,
Yeah.
and I see them every day outside the shelter in different parts of Lowell. So, but let me get back to domestic violence. So, as I said earlier, we all have little arguments with our friends, and sometimes they get a little heated. When does it become domestic violence? When do I go to you and say, look, it's too much? And is it always women?
No, it's not always women, but it's really acts and repeated acts of violence between two people in an intimate relationship. And oftentimes there are signs, warning signs that happen, but that repetition, yes, we have cases where all of a sudden somebody may become high risk and lash out and use either guns or knives and commit a very violent act. Mm-hmm. But most of the those who turn to us and decide to leave a relationship oftentimes have been in there. They've experienced financial abuse, they've experienced emotional and mental health abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and oftentimes they will leave because of their children. Mm-hmm. And that's what we have found over the years. And our shelter is primarily focused on trying to provide a space for those who need to leave immediately. They've made a decision. We do safety planning with them. We find a time for them to turn to us. And as Deb said, years ago, we made a commitment also that instead of having them hop from shelter to shelter, and it was referred to as shelter hopping, we ended up creating a 2-year transitional housing program and 6 units of permanent affordable housing. And many of those have come through our shelter. They went into our transitional housing program and then into the permanent units of permanent affordable housing. It's really helped to stabilize their lives, for them to get into training programs, and most importantly, stabilize their children's lives.
So I know what people are thinking out there. They're thinking, my God, I go every place. They're building new apartments here. They've got the luxury condos over here. They've got beautiful apartments over there. Aren't there enough housing units for people to go into?
Not affordable.
Yeah, no, there's nowhere near enough housing. There's not enough housing units for my nieces and nephews to go into who are college educated and professionally working. Housing is not available, and it is certainly not affordable these days. Mm-hmm. So, no, the answer to that question is there are not enough units available.
And we obviously have the same problem with people that are in recovery.
Right.
We could probably triple our number of housing units for people in recovery and still not have enough sober housing. Yeah. So I think that's part of the answer. There was an interesting statistic I saw that came down from a research company that we have about $1.45 trillion in wasted productivity, in medical costs that are related to things like substance use disorder, mental health disorder, and all the concomitant kinds of things like domestic violence. If we were to fix that and actually provide the right number of housing, the right treatment, and all the supports, the economy would increase by about $1.6 billion.
Wow.
And that's a dramatic turnaround. So there's something to be said in terms of really putting something into this process. So tell me the relationship of what you see to domestic violence, and both physical and mental, because as you say, Kathy, there are a lot of different forms that domestic violence takes, and substance use disorder and mental health, because we have basically a new mental health center in Lowell. We had one that was here for many years, but I would say we are way undergunned in the mental health area. So tell me what you think.
Well, I think someone that's in a mental health crisis, be they an adult or a child, shouldn't be told that there's a 3 or 4 week wait for an intake and an assessment. And sometimes when you're dependent upon publicly funded health care, particularly mental health care, you know, because of the backlog and because of the large numbers of people that are seeking services, there is a really, really long wait. And you know, from the recovery world, you know, you have a moment. You have a moment when a person may be open to treatment and to help, and may be vulnerable enough, and kind of.
And you can't say, oh, just wait a month.
Yeah,
Right.
you know.
And you lose that moment. There is not a bed or a place to go.
That's right. That's right. So yeah, you know, I mean, Lowell is great, particularly compared to other like-size communities in the state. But it doesn't mean that we're meeting all the needs. There's still a lot more to do. And
I think also probably for the longest time, and even today, I truly believe there was not enough, has not been enough, continues to not be enough of resources, money committed to early intervention programs. I think we're starting to get that. I think a lot of the foundations get that in their funding programs, like Deb's, like mine, like yours. But if you do not intervene at early ages in terms of some of the problems, they grow exponentially. Those children who are witnessing domestic violence, experiencing mental health challenges, growing up in an environment where there's substance abuse, if you do not intervene at an early age, they grow up, they end up having children, their children end up having children, and I think
and it's
that's
just repeating the whole cycle.
And it repeats and it grows exponentially, and it's almost as though we cannot keep up with the housing and resources needed oftentimes for some of those families. But I agree with Deb. I think in Lowell there is a strong collaborative community collaboration between the city government and the nonprofits and the business community here. And I think, as Deb said, I don't think any of us could do what we're doing if we did not have the strong community support, and they seem to be there for us whenever we need them.
Yeah, it seems to me that also the economy has a lot to do with domestic violence and some of the things that pop up and some of the stresses people have. Do you find that it kind of goes up with job availability and services?
Well, the economy is a big stressor, that's for sure. And you know, DV certainly is impacted by societal stress and by individual and familial stress. So I would assume the answer to that is yes.
It adds stress, but I say this all the time. When a child is born, they don't come out of the womb saying, I'm going to be a victim, I'm going to be a perpetrator of violence, I'm going to abuse drugs, I'm going to have mental health issues. So I think there are added stresses, but I think my point is that the environment that one grows up in oftentimes impacts who you're going to end up being. And do some people break out of that? Absolutely. Because somewhere along the line there's either a positive role model or a positive person who makes a connection with them. But it's very difficult. It's an extreme challenge. And so the economy has an impact when the economy's not good. But it doesn't cause domestic violence. And when the economy is good, domestic violence doesn't go away. It's still there.
That's right. So, you don't have to mention any names, of course, but let's hear a couple of success stories. People always hear about, this is bad, there's a shelter for that. You've obviously had, like we have, many people that have come through. Talked to one this morning, a 56-year-old woman that's been in recovery now for a year. She's never been sober a day in her life. She's got her job back, her life back, her grandchild.
Wow.
You know how we value grandchildren. Wow. And I think that's such a great success story. We're going to write a presentation about it. And I think she's wonderful. But how about a success story from each of your organizations?
Well, we have a lot of success stories. I mean, by the time a family ends up,
feel good.
Well, you know, I mean, I don't know. I'll tell you what people are dealing with in our shelter, okay? They come from a lifetime of poverty and a lifetime of limited education and limited skill and limited role modeling and limited commitment to education. And they have developed some coping skills that are not healthy coping skills. So any family that goes through our shelter is successfully placed into permanent housing, maintains themselves, hopefully with full-time employment, and maintains their household, and their child ends up ahead of them. That's a success story.
And that's a great success story.
Right, and we see a lot of those, Bill, you know? But our families are still working really hard. They're still very, very poor, and being poor in this society is a full-time job. And it's much harder for you know, to survive and to manage when your resources are extremely limited.
It's not only the housing, it's the jobs,
Yeah.
it's the mental health issues.
It's the parenting skills, it's the
parenting
commitments.
skills. But the success is really breaking that cycle with the children and ultimately getting families in a better place.
Right, and breaking the cycle with the caregivers as well, so that they see that there's another way, that there's a way that they can be responsible and independent and caring for their children. And our job continues to be wrapping all the services around them we possibly can, either services that are from the shelter and the community that supports us, or funded services like mental health and substance abuse and behavioral health issues, and it doesn't really matter. Whatever people
Whatever it
need,
is.
that's what we want to provide for people.
And I would echo what Deb is saying, you know, finding that space to be able to find a way to break free and to move forward. We just recently received a letter from a woman who had been in our shelter in the 1970s, and she wrote a letter. She is now retired, and the letter was to Alternative House and the staff at Alternative House that by coming into our shelter, when she made the decision to break free, gave her some time to have some peace, figure out with our support from our advocates of where to go in her life. But one of the things she highlighted is that when she arrived at our shelter with her daughter, there was another family there, and that daughter wanted to learn how to bake a pie. And I think food oftentimes is the great equalizer and brings peace and comfort to everybody. So they decided,
you know we all love food.
right, and this woman knew how to bake pies. And so the four of them decided to bake a pie. And then the director at that time came into the shelter, saw what they were doing, and said, "Let me go get some ice cream." And she ended up getting peach ice cream. And this woman in her letter said that her fondest memories come from finding some peace, baking the pie with this other woman and her child. And the peach ice cream, every time she would see peach ice cream, it would bring memories back of Alternative House. And then she went on to say how she and her daughter, they went on to live a violence-free life. It was not easy. They struggled. She ended up getting a fairly good job where she also would provide support to those that who might turn to her about domestic violence.
See, that's the thing about success that I think we forget. You know, it starts small. Success is incremental, right?
Yeah.
And the smallest success becomes the foundation for the next small success, for the next small success, for the next medium success. The same way,
builds.
the same way we
to be celebrated.
That's
unto
right.
itself.
That's right, and not minimized. I mean, this pie story, you know, was obviously a eureka moment for this woman, where she felt respected and honored and human and cared for and empowered.
And that really helped her to take that
Right,
next
right,
step. And I think
right.
that's what's so significant. It's not always the big, the big things. It's those little steps that build.
And those of us that deliver this service day in and day out, year after year after year, we have to see those successes, and we have to celebrate those successes, not only because our clients need those successes to be celebrated, but because we know that they're building blocks for anything that's coming afterwards.
And what Deb is saying, celebration, so many of our families haven't had time to celebrate anything.
Yeah, survival.
Because like
Yeah,
you say, you know,
and they're just trying to survive. And so I
Providence is a
think,
24-hour day job.
Yeah.
well, and I think, in Deb's program, I don't want to speak for Deb, but our program, sometimes we celebrate not only birthdays, but maybe for the children, you know, never having a slumber party or a sleepover or a pajama day, and trying to
Or a
at least
birthday
for the-
cake.
Right, birthday cake. So for the small time they're with us, can we create a safe, warm, nurturing environment where they can build upon some of those small activities that make them feel good,
Yeah.
make them feel positive about themselves. And so celebration of things that we take for granted is very important to many of the individuals and families that we work with.
Yeah, that's true.
But unfortunately, some people never get to you. And those are the people, and I'll tell you a story in our family. It was a relative of ours, no names mentioned, but she had an abusive husband, and he not only cheated on her with a woman with the same name, so when he talked to her on the telephone, you know, people couldn't tell, but also stole money from my mother-in-law. You know, there was all kinds of things that happened during that period. And my sister-in-law left him. Well, now I guess we know who it is. She left him and ultimately came to live with us for 6 months and then went back to him again in that same abusive relationship.
Yep.
And lived there and lived with him for at least another 5 or 6 years. He demeaned her, he was cruel, never hit her, but was just as abusive as they could come. So we have people out there that are saying to themselves, well, I have a similar kind of relationship. And what she would say is, I took my vows and I said, until death do us part, I'm going to hold to those vows. What should we do? What should that person that's thinking that out there do and say to themselves at this point that's in an abusive relationship?
You know, I think it's different for everybody
Yeah.
and what triggers and for them to make a move to move on. But if you've been in a relationship where you've become isolated, you've been abused mentally, emotionally, sometimes you begin to believe that. Sometimes it's very scary if you do leave, of what am I going to do now? You know, I don't have any training skills, or how am I going to support myself? Back to survival is 24/7 for some people when they do make a move to maybe change the relationship they're in, to go into recovery, to you know, get off the streets, etc. And sometimes they're just not ready. And so we never give up on anybody. We say, if this is not the time, let's do some safety planning. Please contact us when you're ready. We're going to be there for you to help you move forward. Because it's very scary leaving what might have been a very predictable, even though very violent and emotionally oppressive relationship for somebody.
And you said one of the most important things, and I hope that everyone out here hears that. We don't give up on people.
No,
you don't give
never.
up, we don't give up on people.
Yeah.
When they relapse, we stick with them and we help them through that process, because sometimes for a lot of people it's a life process of really getting things back together. So Deb, what do you think about in terms of that person that's sitting out there and thinking, should I, shouldn't I?
Yeah, you
I've
know,
got my kids at home and I think my kids are threatened, but I don't want to leave him.
Yeah, yeah. I think we internalize roles, and I think we internalize roles of being a victim as well. And I think once we internalize that role, we really can't see a way out of it. And, you know, the whole, I said to death do us part and all that, you know, I mean, if I was being flippant, I'd say, well, wait a little while, because a lot of these relationships do end up in very awful situations, you know. However, you know, I'm not a clinician, but I do know that people will only make a change when they're ready. And sometimes you're reduced to nothing more and less and more than prayer and presence. You know, calling that person, you know, once a week, checking in, you know, how you doing? Are you thinking about another way of life? These are resources that might be available to you. I know Kathy. You know, just, but being a constant reminder to the woman or man that there is a way out. But not sugarcoating it. It's not easy.
It's not easy at all.
Right.
But they also need to understand there is a warm and a loving place that they can go to where they can get help. And that's very important to know.
Right.
Even if they have to wait a month for the service, excuse me, even if they have to wait, we will help them out in some way. And also, I think we find that drugs and alcohol in particular, bind a lot of couples together, and sort of, it's a codependent kind of relationship. And that clouds things for a lot of people. Do you find that?
Well, I didn't really get to talk about my perception of what I think domestic violence is. And what I was going to say, which I think summarized how Kathy explained it, is it's a lack of freedom. So if you have drugs and alcohol in the picture and you're not free from drugs and alcohol, that's a lack of freedom right there, right? And then if you have a perception of yourself as being not worthy of equality and mutuality, that's a lack of freedom right there. Yes, I do think that drugs and alcohol, I think they anesthetize pain. I think they allow us to justify things that aren't justifiable. So I do think that there's a role. And I think, it's safer for some people to be high than it is to live in the real world, especially when they have an abuser in their life.
And that's a tremendous
Absolutely.
fear.
A lot of self-medication goes on.
That's true.
Yeah.
In addiction services, there's a tremendous fear of loneliness.
Yeah.
And it's probably the number one thing that ends up killing people is being lonely, being alone. The Surgeon General found that the being alone during a day, and that's only 20 minutes of contact like we're having now, is more lethal than 13 cigarettes a day. So I think that we try to connect people, and that's what we all do in a positive way. So very quickly, because we got about 2 minutes left,
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm going to go quick. What can we tell people out there if they're in some relationship and they want to know what to do, and who can they call? How do they get this started?
I think I'll let Kathy handle that because it's really...
Yeah, I mean, they can call us, 978-458-0274.
Just repeat that one more time, Kathy.
978-458-0274. That brings you to our shelter, our business line. Actually, we're all trained, all the staff, whether a call comes in on our business line or at our shelter to respond to domestic violence. We're there. We don't expect the community to be experts, but to at least know there is a shelter for those who want to leave a violent relationship, and that they can turn to us for that support, for safety planning, just to listen. If they're not ready to leave, we will listen and we will work with them until they are ready to leave.
In a non-judging way.
In a very non-judging way.
Sometimes it's the judgment that keep people away. I'm embarrassed and I'm ashamed.
Yeah.
Nothing to be ashamed of.
Yep.
Yeah, and that's wonderful. And I think
Because it's not their fault.
yeah.
It's really the perpetrator.
And now with our recovery coaches, so many people have been through addiction and mental health issues and domestic violence issues, so that people that really do understand. And one of the things that's going to be happening in the next few weeks is the opening of our Recovery Cafe, where everybody gets a latte at 3 o'clock. And it may seem like a little piece, but the warmth of the latte, the caring environment, and the loving are critical for people in recovery. And as you said, Deb, that for a lot of people, that's the first step.
First step.
Redoing their relationships. So thank you very much. This
You're
has been
welcome.
terrific.
Thank
and I think
you.
hopefully helpful out there. We know a number to call. We have House of Hope. Look them up. Do you want to give your website?
Hope Lowell, houseofhopelowell.org.
Website.
However,
Yeah.
we're a closed referral,
Okay.
so we can't take referrals from the street. Our referrals come through state agencies.
Okay, but you can direct a person
We
if
can.
you need to.
We can.
Ours
Website?
is alternative-house.org, and there is also a button to exit immediately if you're on the website and the perpetrator in your life catches wind that you are on the website looking
Excellent.
for information.
And I got to tell you, confidentiality is amazing. I still don't know where your houses are. So thank you very much. LowellHouseInc.org. Look for our opening of the Recovery Cafe. And on April 2nd, our wonderful gala will be honoring some surprise people. You're going to be very pleased at who we're honoring. So thank you all, and thank you for another episode of Recovery Matters.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Bill.
you for inviting us.
Yeah.